September 1940. London, England. St. Thomas Hospital on the banks of the Thames. Dr. Geoffrey Keynes, chief surgeon, gazed out the window as Luftwaffe Heinkel bombers traced lines across the night sky. Behind him, in crowded corridors, dozens of civilian wounded awaited treatment after yet another night of bombardment. Keynes turned to his assistant, his face marked by exhaustion from 72 hours of uninterrupted surgeries. The problem wasn't the patients. It wasn't surgical skill. It was blood, or rather the lack of it. Whole blood required constant refrigeration at 4 degrees Celsius, lasted only 5 to 7 days before deteriorating, and required precise blood typing among 8 different types. Donors needed to be summoned at any hour, day or night, to donate fresh blood immediately. There was no stock. There was no system. During the bombings, when hundreds of wounded arrived simultaneously, hospitals ran out of blood within hours. Soldiers and civilians died not for lack of surgeons, but for lack of available blood at the critical moment. Keynes adjusted his surgical gloves and uttered what seemed inevitable, what all European and German medicine considered immutable truth. Blood cannot be stockpiled like ammunition. It deteriorates within days, requires constant refrigeration, and must correspond precisely to the recipient's type. It is simply impossible to create functional blood banks on a scale of total war. Blood is a resource that must be fresh or it is useless. We lose more soldiers and civilians from lack of available blood than from lack of surgical skill. End of section 1. Word count, 249. Aced 2. The thesis of inevitability, the refutation. What Keynes and European physicians did not know, what no German or British surgeon could comprehend at that moment, was that an African-American surgeon at Columbia University, Dr. Charles Richard Drew, had just solved the problem considered impossible through a discovery that would change emergency medicine forever. Drew discovered that blood plasma, the liquid component of blood without red cells, could be separated by centrifugation, preserved for weeks or months with ultraviolet sterilization techniques and addition of merthiolate, and crucially, plasma worked universally in any blood type. It didn't need ABO matching. It could be administered to anyone without prior testing. Between August 1940 and January 1941, through the Blood for Britain program, Drew sent more than 5,000 liters of plasma that saved thousands of British lives during the Blitz. The assumption that liquid life could not be stockpiled was about to be destroyed by American industrial medical abundance. The mathematics of survival was already being rewritten not in the bombed hospitals of London, but in the laboratories of Columbia University in New York. The numbers revealed a disparity so vast that it transformed emergency medicine from improvised art into industrial science. Whole blood, the universal standard in 1940, lasted 5 to 7 days under constant refrigeration at 4 degrees Celsius. Liquid plasma preserved by Drew's method lasted weeks. Dehydrated plasma, developed subsequently, lasted months or years and could be reconstituted in 3 minutes with sterile distilled water. This difference wasn't incremental but revolutionary, completely transforming military medical logistics. Instead of summoning donors during emergencies under bombardment, armies could stockpile plasma like ammunition, transport it across oceans, store it in field depots, and administer it instantly when needed. The universality of plasma destroyed another deadly limitation of whole blood medicine. Whole blood required precise typing among 8 main types: A positive, A negative, B positive, B negative, AB positive, AB negative, O positive, O negative. Typing error meant death by hemolytic reaction. On the battlefield under enemy fire, with wounded arriving in waves, blood typing consumed precious minutes that bleeding soldiers didn't possess. Plasma completely eliminated this problem. It worked universally, could be administered to anyone of any blood type without prior testing. In combat, when seconds determined life or death, this difference was literally existential. Production volume revealed industrial capacity that European medicine simply couldn't match. The Blood for Britain program, operating between August 1940 and January 1941, collected blood from nearly 15,000 donors and sent more than 5,000 liters of plasma to the United Kingdom in just 5 months. Subsequently, the American Red Cross program, directed by Drew as the first director of the National Blood Bank, provided more than 6 million units of plasma to Allied forces throughout the war. Germany, without equivalent techniques for mass preservation and distribution, operated with limited fresh blood supplied by individual donors, summoned case by case. German soldiers died from treatable hemorrhagic shock, not due to medical incompetence, but due to absence of industrial medical system. The statistical impact was devastating in its clarity. In World War I, between 8 and 11 of every 100 wounded soldiers who reached field hospitals alive died in them, primarily from hemorrhagic shock. In World War II, with abundant plasma available, that number dropped to 4.5%. The mortality reduction from approximately 10% to 4.5% meant that for every 100 wounded soldiers, plasma saved 5 to 6 additional lives that would have been lost a generation earlier. Multiplied by millions of Allied wounded, Drew's plasma saved hundreds of thousands of lives, a strategic force multiplier that the Axis couldn't replicate. In 1940, Dr. Charles Richard Drew completed his doctoral thesis at Columbia University entitled Banked Blood, a Study on Blood Preservation, becoming the first African American to receive a Doctor of Science in Medicine from Columbia. His research wasn't theoretical, but intensely practical, establishing precise protocols that would transform laboratory methods into mass industrial operations. Drew demonstrated that plasma could be separated from blood by centrifugation, stored in sterile conditions with ultraviolet light for sterilization, preserved with antibacterial merthiolate in a dilution of 1 to 10,000, and tested regularly for bacterial contamination. Each step was documented, replicable, scalable. It wasn't medical magic, but systematic biological engineering. Immediately after graduating, Drew was recruited to direct the Blood for Britain program in August 1940, when Britain faced existential crisis under Luftwaffe bombardment. In just 5 months, Drew transformed academic laboratory procedures into the first mass plasma production operation in history. He created central collection stations that would become precursors to modern blood banks, standardized bacteriological and serological quality tests, established cold-chain transatlantic transport using Clipper aircraft, and organized participating hospitals into a coordinated network. The challenge was immense. Collect blood from thousands of voluntary donors at multiple hospitals using varied methods, process it into sterile plasma, bottle it in 1-liter containers, test it for contamination and syphilis, pack it 6 bottles per box, and transport it across the Atlantic to Britain under bombardment. The final Blood for Britain numbers demonstrated the viability of mass industrial medicine. During 5 months of operation, 14,556 donations were collected from voluntary donors. After processing, 6,151 liters of plasma were produced. Rigorous bacteriological tests discarded 361 liters contaminated at participating hospitals and 160 liters at the central laboratory directed by Dr. Frank Melanie, a combined loss of 8.5% from contamination. Serological tests rejected 151 donations for evidence of syphilis, a rate of 1.03%. Total loss from all causes was 581 liters, 9.4%. More than 5,000 liters of plasma reached Britain in sterile condition, ready for immediate use. Each liter represented the capacity to save multiple lives in trauma emergencies. The Blood for Britain experience revealed a fundamental truth that would separate Allied medicine from Axis medicine. Blood and plasma had to be handled in a completely closed system to remain sterile and safe. Late contamination of initially sterile batches forced implementation of more rigid bacteriological controls. Drew insisted that the collection system be completely sealed from venipuncture to final administration. This attention to sanitary engineering details, this application of industrial quality control principles to medicine, was characteristically American. It wasn't enough to have correct science. It was necessary to have a system that guaranteed correct execution at a scale of millions of units. Drew built that system. When the United States entered the war in December 1941, Drew had already established the foundations. He was appointed first director of the American Red Cross Blood Bank, and created bloodmobiles, mobile collection units that revolutionized blood donation and are still used globally today. Under his direction, the Red Cross established a national network of collection centers, standardized equipment and procedures, trained thousands of technicians, and organized logistics to supply plasma to armed forces on an unprecedented scale. Between 1941 and 1945, the American program provided more than 6 million units of plasma to Allied forces in all theaters of war. This abundance wasn't accident, but result of systematic industrial planning. Normandy, June 6, 1944, D-Day. Omaha and Utah beaches transformed into slaughter as American divisions faced devastating German fire. American field medics operated under conditions that would have been impossible a generation earlier. They had access to thousands of units of dehydrated plasma stockpiled in mobile depots. When soldiers were wounded, medics reconstituted plasma in 3 minutes by adding sterile distilled water to lyophilized powder and administered immediate transfusion on the battlefield, often under direct fire. This was impossible with whole blood that required constant refrigeration and precise blood typing. American medical estimates indicate that 30 to 40% of soldiers seriously wounded in Normandy would have died without immediate plasma. In a single day, plasma saved approximately 2,000 to 3,000 American lives on the beaches. Germans operating on the same beaches defending against invasion had no equivalent access. They depended on fresh blood from summoned donors, a system that worked reasonably in rear hospitals but collapsed completely in high-intensity combat. German physicians were excellent, trained in the finest European medical tradition, but operated with chronic resource scarcity. Wounded German soldiers died waiting for blood that never came, not from surgical incompetence but from absence of industrial medical logistics system. The disparity wasn't in medical knowledge but in capacity to transform knowledge into operational abundance. Captured German medical reports after the war revealed deep frustration. A 1944 Wehrmacht report, admitted with brutal candor. Americans have unlimited plasma available on the battlefield. Our soldiers die from hemorrhagic shock waiting for fresh blood that doesn't exist in necessary quantities. It isn't a question of medical competence or surgical skill. It's a question of industrial logistics that we simply cannot match with our limited resources. Another report observed that wounded American soldiers received plasma transfusions within minutes of injury, often administered by medics with weeks of training, while German wounded waited hours for blood that frequently never arrived. The contrast was devastating not only in lives lost but in morale of troops who understood the disparity. The Japanese experience was even worse. Japan essentially had no organized blood transfusion or plasma distribution system. Wounded Japanese soldiers received often excellent surgical treatment when they reached rear hospitals, but lacked the fluid resuscitation capacity that kept Allied soldiers alive long enough to reach surgeons. Japanese wounded mortality rate from hemorrhagic shock was approximately 3 times higher than the American rate. Captured Japanese physicians expressed almost reverential admiration for the American medical system, not for individual surgeon skill, but for the abundance of life-saving resources available at all treatment levels. The Soviet Union, facing the Wehrmacht on the Eastern Front, developed its own mass transfusion system based on a national network of donation centers established before the war in 1926. The Central Institute for Blood Transfusion in Moscow coordinated approximately 2,500 donor centers. About 2,000 people per day donated blood in Moscow alone, volume comparable to the 2 collection centers in New York. Soviets primarily used type O blood for battlefield transfusions and also produced large quantities of plasma. They transported blood in 4-corner isothermic containers by aircraft to front lines. The Soviet system was less sophisticated than the American, but functioned on massive scale, demonstrating that total war industrial medicine required national organization before hostilities began. The contrast with Germany was instructive. The Wehrmacht had excellent physicians, surgeons of recognized skill, university medical tradition dating back centuries. But the German transfusion system was fragmented, inadequately organized, chronically short of supplies. A civilian program established in 1940 allowed donations only of Aryan blood and paid 10 marks for the first 100 cubic centimeters. The military program was improvised extension of this civilian system. The laboratory for blood transfusion in Berlin, which should have coordinated the military program, was destroyed by Allied bombing, further disorganizing an already inadequate system. Germany was trying to fight an industrial war with an artisanal medical system. The German experience with preserved blood between 1940 and 1942 was disastrous. There were so many severe reactions that medical officers lost interest in the concept. Those who reported satisfactory results were generally in favorable positions along rear transport lines. Some German medical officers claimed never to have seen preserved blood used in the field without deleterious febrile reactions. Plasma and serum were rarely used, although officers who captured American plasma stocks were enthusiastic about its effectiveness. This irony was revealing. Germany had scientific knowledge but didn't have industrial system to transform knowledge into operational abundance. America had both. Donors were a constant problem for Germany. They included medical personnel, nurses, staff assistants, and lightly wounded soldiers. Attempts were always made to exclude tuberculosis, malaria, and syphilis in donors, but serological examinations were rarely practical, and the donor's declaration that he didn't have syphilis generally had to be accepted for lack of alternatives. Blood groups recorded in soldiers' paybooks were often incorrect, and new determinations had to be made before each transfusion. If this wasn't possible, a test injection of 10 cubic centimeters of blood was administered to verify compatibility. Each complication multiplied necessary time, and time was exactly what bleeding soldiers didn't have. Dr. Charles Drew not only invented the plasma preservation system, but also created the organizational infrastructure that made mass production possible. His bloodmobiles were fully equipped mobile units that could convert any room into a miniature collection infirmary in 20 minutes. Each unit had refrigeration, sterile collection equipment, sufficient supplies to process dozens of donations, and trained personnel. They could be dispatched to any location as need fluctuated. During the war, these units operated continuously, collecting blood in factories, military bases, civilian communities, universities. Blood donation became civic ritual, tangible expression of participation in the war effort. Standardization multiplied efficiency. Each American dehydrated plasma unit came in a standardized kit. One can containing a 400 cubic centimeter bottle with dried plasma, another can with a bottle of sterile distilled water for reconstitution, set of sterile disposable tubes for administration. A medic with minimal training could prepare and administer transfusion in 3 minutes under any conditions. There was no confusion about procedure, no variation between batches, no need for refrigeration until reconstitution. The system was designed to function in the hands of thousands of medics with varying training levels, under combat stress, in impossible conditions. And it worked. The magnitude of the operation was impressive. 6 million units of plasma provided between 1941 and 1945 represented blood from approximately 13 million individual donations, considering that each whole blood donation produced approximately 450 cubic centimeters of plasma. 13 million donations from tens of millions of American volunteers, each contributing literally part of themselves to the war effort. This mass civilian mobilization for medical purpose had no precedent in history. It was industrialization of compassion, abundance applied to life preservation on continental scale. The Pacific revealed another dimension of American medical logistics advantage. Okinawa, April to June 1945, witnessed 40,000 American casualties during 3 months of brutal combat. Treatment involved use of approximately 40,000 pints of whole blood, a 1-to-1 ratio. All blood used in Okinawa was transported by air from the United States, a distance of 8,000 miles. With shelf life established at 21 days, the operation required careful timing to guarantee adequate supply with minimum waste from expiration. The operation was successful for 2 reasons. First, blood supply from the United States via Guam was highly efficient. Second, the commanding general, with complete agreement of the task force surgeon, designated a trained transfusion officer with complete responsibility for supply, distribution, and correct use of all blood brought to the island. This attention to logistics details, this willingness to designate substantial resources to medical support system, reflected American understanding that soldiers were valuable assets whose lives were worth massive investment. Germans and Japanese treated soldiers as renewable resources, replaceable through recruitment. Americans treated each soldier as investment in training, experience, and morale that should be preserved through superior medicine. This philosophical difference translated into survival rate difference that affected not only individual casualties, but combat capacity of entire units. American units maintained combat effectiveness longer because wounded returned to service instead of dying from treatable injuries. April 1945. American Field Hospital in Remagen, Germany. Dr. Hans Schmidt, captured German surgeon working as medical prisoner treating wounded from both sides under Geneva Convention, observed American transfusion operation with expression of growing incredulity. Schmidt was product of the finest German medical tradition, trained at Heidelberg University, experienced surgeon who had operated under fire at Stalingrad and Normandy. He had seen enough horrors for a lifetime, but what he witnessed now wasn't horror. It was abundance so extreme it broke his fundamental understanding of how war medicine functioned. Wounded American soldiers arrived at the field hospital in waves after intense combat. Each received plasma immediately, administered by medics still on stretchers before even entering surgical tents. Inside the hospital, Schmidt watched American physicians using plasma without hesitation, without careful calculation of scarcity, without debate about who deserved limited resource. Unit after unit, bottle after bottle administered with the casualness of dispensing infinite commodity. He observed stacked boxes containing hundreds of dehydrated plasma units, each capable of being reconstituted in 3 minutes. There was more plasma in this single field hospital than in any entire German division Schmidt had served. The contrast with German experience was devastating and impossible to ignore. German hospitals operated with chronic scarcity of everything: blood, plasma, antibiotics, anesthetics, even basic supplies like bandages and antiseptics. German surgeons made brutal triage decisions daily, choosing who would receive limited resources and who would be left to die because the system simply didn't have capacity to save everyone. Schmidt personally had made these choices hundreds of times, carrying the moral weight of each decision. German soldiers died waiting for blood that never came, waiting for surgery that never happened, not from medical incompetence but from logistics system collapse. Now he observed a completely different system. American physicians didn't make scarcity calculations, didn't debate who deserved treatment, simply treated everyone because they had resources to do so. Schmidt watched a wounded German soldier, prisoner like himself, receiving exactly the same treatment as American soldiers. Plasma administered immediately, surgery performed by experienced surgeon, penicillin antibiotics administered to prevent infection, post-operative care in clean and well-equipped facility. The German soldier had better chance of survival as American prisoner than he would have as patient in German hospital. This irony was philosophically devastating. Schmidt perceived truth that transcended medicine. It wasn't a question of surgical skill. German surgeons were as competent as Americans, often more experienced due to years of war. It wasn't a question of theoretical medical knowledge. German universities had scientific tradition equal or superior to American. The difference lay in an industrial system that transformed knowledge into operational abundance. An American black physician, Dr. Charles Drew, had invented a method to preserve plasma that Germany, with all its medical tradition, didn't develop or couldn't implement at scale. And America transformed that discovery into millions of units distributed globally through logistics system that functioned like Ford assembly line applied to medicine. Schmidt later wrote in diary preserved in archives, "I now understand our defeat in terms that transcend individual battles. They don't just have more tanks, more planes, more soldiers. They have systems that transform science into operational abundance that we cannot match." An American black physician invented method to preserve universally compatible plasma. Germany didn't do this. And even if we had made the discovery, we wouldn't have industrial capacity to produce millions of units and distribute them globally. We didn't lose medical war from scientific incompetence. We lost because they industrialized life-saving, while we still operated with essentially artisanal methods of the previous century. Schmidt's realization was microcosm of larger recognition happening throughout the Wehrmacht. Modern industrial war isn't won by individual bravery or specific technical superiority, but by capacity to transform resources into systems that function at continental scale. Drew's plasma was perfect manifestation of this truth. It wasn't incomprehensible technology. It was systematic application of known science through industrial organization, quality control, distribution logistics, and mass training. Germany could comprehend science, but couldn't replicate system. And in total war, system wins every time. The final statistics were overwhelming in their totality and unequivocal in their verdict. Between 1941 and 1945, the American Red Cross provided more than 6 million units of plasma to Allied forces in all theaters of war. The Blood for Britain program, operating only 5 months between 1940 and 1941, sent more than 5,000 liters to Britain when the country faced existential crisis under bombardment. Mortality of wounded soldiers who reached field hospitals alive fell from 8 to 11% in World War I to 4.5% in World War II, a reduction that saved an estimated 300,000 additional Allied lives. Dehydrated plasma lasted months or years, versus 5 to 7 days of refrigerated whole blood. Plasma worked universally in any blood type versus need for precise matching among 8 whole blood types. Blood banks and blood mobiles created by Drew save millions of lives annually to this day, more than 70 years after their invention. Surgeon General Thomas Perrin declared in 1948, Dr. Charles Drew's work in plasma preservation saved more American lives than many victorious battles. He transformed emergency medicine from improvised art practiced by talented individuals into industrial science that could be replicated at a scale of millions of treatments. His contribution to Allied victory is immeasurable, but absolutely fundamental. This assessment wasn't hyperbole, but recognition of statistical reality. Each soldier saved by plasma could return to combat after recovery, multiplying unit effectiveness that maintained experienced veterans instead of constantly replacing them with recruits. Sir Geoffrey Keynes, British surgeon who had declared it impossible to stockpile blood in September 1940, wrote in post-war testimony, American plasma kept Britain alive during the Blitz. When bombings caused hundreds of wounded simultaneously, plasma was there, abundant, universal, saving lives that whole blood simply couldn't save. Dr. Drew gave us the gift of time to treat wounded, time for surgery, time for recovery. In war, time is everything. His discovery transformed time from enemy into ally. This confession from Keynes, acknowledging fundamental error in his initial assumptions, represented larger recognition of European medicine. American innovation came not only from superior science but from capacity to industrialize science into abundant systems. The tragic irony of racial segregation stained scientific triumph. In 1942, when Drew served as first director of the American Red Cross Blood Bank, U.S. Armed Forces ordered that blood be segregated by donor race. Blood from African Americans had to be marked separately, presumably inferior or inadequate for white soldiers. Drew protested vehemently. He declared publicly with unequivocal scientific clarity, "There is no racial difference in human blood. None. This policy is based on prejudice, not science, and will lead to unnecessary deaths of soldiers who will die waiting for blood of the same race when blood of any race would save them immediately." He resigned his position in protest, refusing to administer a system that violated both science and basic morality. The irony was devastating on multiple layers. The man who saved hundreds of thousands of Allied lives, whose work was fundamental to military victory, was considered inadequate to donate blood to the system he created due to skin color. White soldiers received plasma that could have come from black donors, saving their lives, but the system insisted on segregation that had no scientific basis. Drew fought this hypocrisy until his premature death in 1950, at 45 years old, in a car accident. His death gave rise to false urban legend that he was denied treatment by White Hospital, a legend that wasn't true, but revealed deeper truth about reality of segregation that Drew fought throughout his career. Drew's legacy transcended numbers and statistics. Every modern blood bank, every plasma transfusion, every life saved in emergency room traces direct lineage to his 1940 research. Bloodmobiles that Drew invented still operate globally, saving millions of lives annually 75 years after their invention. Preservation techniques he developed still form foundation of modern transfusion medicine. Quality control, sterilization, and distribution system he organized established standards followed worldwide. Drew didn't just make scientific discovery. He created organizational infrastructure that transformed discovery into operational abundance. The historical lesson was profound and multifaceted. Modern total war isn't won only by superior weapons, but by systems that preserve human lives to continue fighting. Germany and Japan lost not only because they produced fewer tanks and planes, but because they treated soldiers as disposable resources replaceable through recruitment. America invested massively in preserving each soldier through superior medicine, recognizing that trained and experienced veteran was worth more than 10 recruits. Drew's plasma was manifestation of this philosophy. Each unit represented investment in preserving human life as valuable strategic asset. Drew proved truth that transcended medicine. Innovation combined with industrialization saves more lives than individual excellence. Preserved plasma democratized survival. Wounded soldier on remote Pacific beach had access to same life-saving resource as patient in advanced urban hospital. Geography ceased to be destiny. Treatable injury ceased to be death sentence. The system Drew created transformed chance into calculable probability. If you reached a medic alive, you had 95.5% chance of surviving to hospital and receiving definitive treatment. This statistical change, seemingly small compared with 10% mortality of previous generation, represented hundreds of thousands of fathers, sons, husbands, and brothers who returned home instead of dying on distant battlefields. And sometimes, heroes who save millions never fire a shot. Don't command armies, don't plan battles. They simply transform science into abundance that makes victory possible. Dr. Charles Richard Drew was such a hero, an African-American physician who faced segregation and prejudice, but whose work saved more Allied lives than many celebrated generals. His contribution wasn't widely recognized during life, because the society that benefited from his genius refused to fully recognize his humanity. But history, final and impartial judge, pronounced unequivocal verdict. Drew transformed war medicine, saved hundreds of thousands of lives, and left legacy that continues saving millions decades after his premature death. By any significant measure of contribution to Allied victory and subsequent human welfare, Dr. Charles Drew deserves place among great heroes of World War II.